It's mid-June and I'm way overdue in giving an update on how the pond is doing. I have some good news and I have some bad news regarding the pond, so I'll start with the good news. My last update was at Christmas, after the pond had frozen over for a week or so. The ice and the cold weather didn't really have much impact on either the plant or animal life in the pond, and there wasn't any more significant cold weather for the rest of the winter. I had spread lots of fallen leaves around the pond last autumn. The leaves form an effective mulch for the ground and provide an excellent environment for various insects, which in turn provide food for certain bird species such as robins, blackbirds and thrushes. Also, the leaf mulch is easy to collect. I live on a tree-lined street, so it's an easy task to go out and collect a few barrowfuls. Plus the neighbours think I'm being civic-minded for clearing the street, so that's a plus as well. Unfortunately, a lot of the leaves blew into the pond over the winter, and I suspect that the increase in nutrients in the water caused a big increase in pond algae that appeared in the pond during the early and late spring. I was a bit concerned that the pond would be completely overwhelmed by algae as the year progressed, and I spent a good bit of time fishing out a lot of the algae with a stick. But as it happened, in the end, it wasn't much of a problem. As spring rolled by, the pond plants began to re-emerge and grow. The marigolds began to flower at the beginning of March, and the underwater plants, such as the lilies, began to sprout leaves and head towards the surface. It's amazing really how quickly the plants around the pond margins have bedded in. The irises settled in nicely fairly quickly, but the real star is the water mint. It spread rapidly all around the pond, and the root system has helped bind the soil around the edges of the pond. The meadowsweet plant has grown quite substantially, and as have the rushes. So overall, around the edges of the pond, it's starting to look more natural. In mid-March, frog spawn appeared in the pond. Not a huge amount, but clearly enough frogs had survived from the previous winter to mate and spawn. I mentioned the issue of pond algae earlier. I decided to put in some barley straw in the pond probably early March. The straw releases a chemical as it breaks down, which is supposed to combat the algae and reduce it. For the first few weeks it didn't really make any difference, but as the straw began to rot down in the water, the algae began to reduce. Around the same time, the frog spawn had become tadpoles, and they attacked the algae with abandon. It turns out it's a favourite food of theirs. So between the straw and the tadpoles, really by the end of May, there was hardly any algae left, and the water was clear all the way down to the bottom of the pond. As June approached, the tadpoles began to transform into little frogs, and hopefully enough will survive to spawn next year and continue the cycle. The frogs weren't the only survivors from last year. As summer approaches, I began to see dragonfly larvae crawling around in the pond. So it looks like the efforts of the ruddy darter dragonflies that I saw last year were successful. So as June approached, I was pretty happy with the pond overall. The plants had become established, and the species that had settled in it the previous year were settling in and thriving. And that brings me to the bad news that I mentioned at the start. As it happens, my wife and I are planning some construction work to the house, and as part of that, we decided we need a garden shed which will be located at the end of the garden. The problem is that the best spot for the shed overlaps with the current location of the pond, so the pond has to go. Now, having spent so much time making the pond and getting so much pleasure and enjoyment from seeing the wildlife settle in the pond and around the pond, I'm obviously not going to destroy the pond as such. Instead, my plan is to relocate the pond, including all the creatures and plants, to a new location elsewhere in the garden. So it's not really bad news. Well, when I say it's not really bad news, it is a little bit of bad news for me. Because if it seems like moving a pond a couple of metres leftwards in a garden seems like an awful lot of work, you'd be right. It will be a huge amount of work. Or rather, it was. Over the June bank holiday weekend a couple of weeks ago, I spent 5 straight days digging the new pond and relocating everything from the old pond into it. That, however, will be the subject for the next video, which I hope to put out in a couple of weeks. So if you've lasted to the end of the video, thanks very much for your attention, and hopefully you'll tune in for the next one where you will see the new pond being built.